echoes of a forgotten past, a story of secrets and lies. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in silver sheets over the small coastal town of Marlowe's End, turning its cobblestone streets into mirrors of storm clouds. From the window of an old manor perched on the cliffside, a woman stood watching the sea churn beneath the lightning's flash. Her name was Clara Winslow, and though she didn't know it yet, the past she thought she had buried was coming back to haunt her. The sound of the wind against the window reminded her of whispers, soft, almost familiar, like echoes from another life. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting second, she thought she heard a voice call her name. Clara. Her eyes flew open. There was no one in the room, only the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint hum of the storm outside. She pressed a trembling hand against the cold glass, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the truth she had spent years running from. But now, it seemed, the truth had found her first. It all began that morning when the letter arrived. A simple envelope, yellowed at the edges, with no return address. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, the kind of script that belonged to another century. Inside was a single piece of parchment, folded twice. To Miss Clara Winslow, the past is not dead. It waits beneath the silence. Meet me at Hollow Bridge at midnight.
E.
Her heart skipped. There was no signature she recognized, but that single initial sent a chill through her veins.
E.
Only one person had ever written to her that way, and he was supposed to be dead. Clara sat by the fire that evening, her mind restless. The rain continued to fall, and every shadow in the room seemed to move with purpose. She poured herself a cup of tea, trying to steady her nerves, but the clinking of the cup against the saucer betrayed her trembling hands. She told herself it was a trick, a cruel prank. Perhaps someone from the village had heard stories of her past. They whispered enough already. The reclusive widow, they called her. The woman who never left her house. But no one knew the truth. Not about the accident. Not about Edward. Not about the lies. When the clock struck 11, Clara found herself standing before the mirror, buttoning her coat. The raincoat she wore was the same one from that night, years ago, the night that had changed everything. She hesitated for a moment, staring at her reflection. The woman staring back looked older, haunted, her eyes filled with secrets she'd never dared to speak aloud. She grabbed an umbrella and stepped out into the storm. Hollow Bridge lay at the edge of the forest, a place where mist hung low and the sound of rushing water echoed beneath the arches. It was a forgotten road now, half swallowed by time and moss. As she approached, her boots sank into the soft earth. The air was cold and smelled faintly of salt and decay. She stopped beneath the bridge's stone archway, her lantern casting long, wavering shadows. "Hello," she called softly. Only the sound of the rain answered. Then footsteps. She turned sharply, her breath caught in her throat. A tall figure stood a few yards away, cloaked in darkness. "Who are you?" she demanded. The figure didn't move. Lightning flashed, and for a brief instant, she saw his face. Her heart nearly stopped.
It couldn't be.
"Edward," she whispered. But before she could take another step, the light from her lantern flickered and went out. When she awoke, she was lying on the ground, her clothes damp, her head throbbing. The lantern was shattered beside her, and the bridge was empty. She sat up, gasping, her eyes darting through the darkness. "Edward," she cried. Only the rain answered again. She stumbled to her feet and felt something beneath her shoe. A small object half buried in the mud. She bent down and picked it up. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age, but she recognized it instantly. Inside, under the cracked glass, was a photograph of her and Edward on the day they were married. Her pulse quickened. She had thrown that locket into the sea the night he died. Or the night she thought he had died. The next morning, Clara sat in her study, staring at the locket on the table. She hadn't slept. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every gust of wind sounded like a voice whispering her name. She needed answers, but there was no one left she trusted enough to ask. Almost no one. She reached for the telephone and dialed a number She hadn't called in years. Detective Harris, a rough voice answered after 2 rings. Arthur, it's Clara. A pause. Then, surprise in his tone. Clara Winslow? I thought you left Marlowe's End for good. I tried, she said softly, but it seems the past didn't agree.
He sighed.
What's happened? She hesitated, glancing at the locket. I think someone's playing games with me. Or worse, I think Edward is alive. Silence filled the line. Then, Arthur's steady voice returned. Meet me at the station this afternoon. And Clara, bring whatever you found. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the air was thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. Clara placed the locket in her coat pocket and stepped out of the manor. The sea was calm now, but beneath its stillness, she could feel it, the weight of secrets waiting to rise. As she reached the gate, she noticed something else. A small envelope, tucked beneath the iron latch. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside was a single photograph taken recently. It showed her, standing by the window of her study, watching the storm. And scrawled across the bottom, in the same elegant handwriting, were the words, I never left, Clara. I only waited for you to remember. Her hands shook as she looked around, but the street was empty. Not a soul in sight. The wind carried faint whispers from the sea, echoing against the cliffs. And for the first time in years, Clara Winslow realized something she had long denied. The past wasn't done with her. It was only beginning to speak. By the time Clara reached the old police station in town, the clouds had thinned to a pale gray. The rain had left the streets glistening, puddles reflecting the worn signs of shops that had closed long ago. She hesitated before pushing open the heavy oak doors, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, the familiar smell of old paper, damp coats, and stale coffee filled the air. Detective Arthur Harris looked up from behind his desk. He had aged since she last saw him, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, his face marked by the years of unsolved cases and sleepless nights. But his eyes were still the same, sharp, questioning, and tired of lies. Clara Winslow, he said, rising from his chair. Didn't think I'd ever see you again. Nor did I, she murmured, managing a faint smile. But I suppose the past had other plans. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. Tell me everything. Clara placed the silver locket on his desk. It glimmered faintly in the morning light. Arthur picked it up carefully, turning it in his rough hands. I remember this, he said softly. You wore it the day they pulled Edward's car from the river. Her eyes darkened.
Yes.
And I threw it into the sea after the funeral. He looked up sharply. Then how do you have it now? It was left for me, she said, under the hollow bridge last night, along with this. She slid the mysterious letter across the table. Arthur read it slowly, his expression tightening. The past is not dead, he read aloud. It waits beneath the silence. And signed with just an E. He looked at her. You're sure it's his handwriting? Clara hesitated. I can't be sure. It's been years, but it feels like him. The way he looped the letters, the rhythm of the words, it's too precise to be coincidence. Arthur leaned back, studying her. You think Edward might still be alive? I don't know what to think, she said quietly. But I saw someone at the bridge last night. I thought it was him. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. Edward Winslow's death was ruled an accident. His car went off the bridge after the storm that night. You remember that? Her voice trembled. I remember everything about that night, Arthur. I remember the storm, the crash, the water, but not him. I never saw his body. He nodded slowly. Because it was never found. Just the wreck. The silence between them grew heavy, filled only by the ticking of the wall clock. Then Arthur said, All right. I'll reopen the case. Quietly. But I need to know, what exactly were you and Edward hiding back then? Clara stiffened. We weren't hiding anything. Arthur gave her a weary look. You forget, Clara. I was there. I remember how nervous you both were that year before he died. The strange bank withdrawals. The business trips that led nowhere. And that man who kept following you. She lowered her gaze. It was complicated. It always is, he said, picking up his pen. Start from the beginning. She took a deep breath. Edward wasn't just a historian. That's what people believed, but it was only half true. He worked for a private organization, the Archival Institute. They dealt with historical artifacts, but also with things that weren't meant to be found. Arthur frowned. What kind of things? Documents, she said softly. Letters, maps, ancient seals. Objects connected to forgotten families, buried scandals. The kind of things that could ruin reputations if brought to light. He scribbled notes. So, secrets. Yes, she whispered. Secrets and lies. Edward called them echoes of history, truths that refused to stay buried. He said the past had a way of speaking through time. Arthur looked up. And what did he find before he died? Clara hesitated. Something about Marlowe's end. Something connected to an old family, the Ashbournes. There were rumors of a hidden estate beneath the cliffs. He said it held proof of something terrible. But before he could tell me more, he disappeared. Arthur closed his notebook. The Ashbourne family vanished nearly a century ago. Fire took their house, if I recall. That's what the records say, she said. But Edward believed the fire was a cover-up. He leaned forward. And you think whatever he found back then, it's resurfacing now? Clara nodded. It's the only thing that makes sense. Arthur stood. All right, I'll start digging. But Clara, his tone softened. If this is someone trying to hurt you, we need to be careful. People don't play games like this for nothing. She met his gaze. I'm not afraid of ghosts, Arthur. I'm afraid of the truth. That afternoon, Clara returned to the manor, her mind spinning with fragments of memories she'd spent years trying to forget. She wandered through the empty halls, her footsteps echoing softly. Every painting, every book, every faded letter seemed to whisper of Edward. In his old study, she found a locked drawer in the desk. The key was gone, but she forced it open with a letter opener. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with a crimson ribbon. Her breath caught as she untied it. The pages were covered in Edward's handwriting, notes, sketches, coordinates, and names. At the top of one page was a heading, The Ashbourne File, Truth Beneath the Ruins. And beneath it, written hastily in pencil, If anything happens to me, look for the bell tower. Clara froze. The bell tower. There was only one in Marlowe's End, the one that stood beside the ruins of the old Ashbourne chapel, long abandoned. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The rain had returned, tapping against the window like ghostly fingers. She sat by the fire, staring at Edward's notes, reading his words over and over. At last, she rose, slipped the pages into her coat pocket, and left the house once more. The town was silent, wrapped in fog. The path to the chapel was overgrown, the stone steps slick with moss. When she reached the crumbling tower, she paused, her lantern casting long shadows through the fog. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of rot and old wood. The bell above her was rusted, its chains swaying slightly, though there was no wind. She raised her lantern higher and saw something carved into the wall near the altar. Fresh marks, jagged and deliberate. The words were simple, but they chilled her to the bone. You shouldn't have come back. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, the lantern trembling in her hand. Who's there? She called. No answer. The footsteps came closer. She took a step back, her heart hammering. The lantern's light flickered, shadows twisting around her. And then a voice, a man's voice, calm and low, spoke from the darkness. Still chasing ghosts, Clara? The lantern fell from her hand, crashing to the floor. The flame flared and died, plunging the chapel into darkness. Her voice broke. Edward. But the only reply was silence, followed by the sound of the chapel door slamming shut. The next morning, the sun barely broke through the fog that clung to Marlowe's End. Clara sat at the edge of her bed, her clothes still damp from the night before. Her hands trembled as she replayed the events in her mind. The chapel, the carvings, and the voice. She was certain she had heard Edward. The tone, the inflection, it was him. But that was impossible. Or was it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a firm knock at the door. She hesitated before answering, pulling her robe tighter around her. When she opened it, Detective Arthur Harris stood on the porch, raincoat slung over one arm, a grim look on his face. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I haven't," she replied quietly, stepping aside. "Come in." Arthur entered the manor, glancing around as though the house itself might reveal something. "I checked the records," he said, setting his hat on the table. "The Ashbourne Chapel was condemned 20 years ago. No one's supposed to be anywhere near it." Clara nodded. "I went there last night." Arthur's eyebrows shot up. "You what?" "I had to," she said. "Edward's notes mentioned the bell tower. I thought I'd find answers." He frowned. "And did you?" Her voice was faint. "I found a message carved into the wall." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "A message?" She nodded. It said, "You shouldn't have come back." And then, her voice broke slightly. "I heard someone. A man. He spoke to me. I think it was Edward." Arthur exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Clara, I don't doubt what you heard. But if someone's trying to make you believe Edward's alive, it's because they want to control what you do next. That message wasn't a warning, it was a threat." They moved to the study, where Clara laid out the pages from Edward's file on the desk. Arthur examined them, adjusting his glasses as he read the neat handwriting. "Coordinates, dates, names," he muttered. "This isn't random. He was tracking something." "He mentioned an archive," Clara said. "A place where secrets were kept. He called it the Ashbourne file." Arthur tapped one of the pages. "These coordinates lead somewhere close to the cliffs. There's nothing on the modern maps, but the old ones." He paused, flipping through his phone. "Yes. There used to be a tunnel system under the chapel. It was sealed off after the fire." Clara leaned forward. "Then that's where we'll find it." Arthur gave her a hard look. "We?" "Clara, this isn't a game. Whoever's been leaving you messages doesn't want you finding that place." Her eyes glinted with determination. "Edward risked his life for this. I need to know why." Arthur sighed. "You always were stubborn." By dusk, they were back at the chapel. The fog rolled thick across the graveyard, and the sound of the distant waves echoed like murmurs of the dead. Arthur carried a flashlight, while Clara clutched the lantern she had repaired that morning. "Stay close," he said as they entered the ruined chapel. The carved message on the wall was still there, though fainter now under the shifting shadows. Arthur ran his hand along the stone near the altar. "If there's a hidden passage, it would be somewhere around here." Clara joined him, brushing dust from the cracks in the wall. Then her hand stopped on a section that felt hollow. She pressed gently, and a faint click echoed through the chamber. A panel in the floor slid open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Arthur shone his flashlight down the steps. "Well, I'll be damned." Clara swallowed hard. This must be it. They descended cautiously. The air grew colder, the walls damp with age. The tunnel twisted beneath the earth, lit only by the flicker of their lights. After several minutes, the passage widened into a stone chamber. Inside were shelves lined with boxes, old ledgers, and metallic crates marked with strange symbols. Dust coated everything, but the space was well preserved, like it had been protected from time itself. Arthur whistled under his breath. "Looks like your husband was telling the truth." Clara stepped forward, running her fingers over the spine of a weathered book. This is the archive." She opened one of the boxes. Inside were stacks of photographs, letters sealed with wax, and newspapers dated as far back as 1873. She pulled out one and read aloud. "Lord Ashbourne's experiments must remain secret until the end. The truth cannot be allowed to reach the public." Her brow furrowed. "Experiments?" Arthur frowned. "What kind of experiments?" They sifted through the documents, piecing together fragments of history. The Ashbournes had been more than a noble family. They had been involved in something far darker. Human trials, forbidden research, manipulation of records to erase entire bloodlines. Good God, Arthur muttered. This isn't just a scandal. It's a cover-up that spans generations. Clara's hands shook as she unfolded a final page, one written in Edward's handwriting. I've found proof that the Ashbourne bloodline continues. Someone in town still bears their name, but they've changed it. If you're reading this, Clara, you must uncover who they are. They'll come for you once they know you're close. Her heart pounded. He knew he was being watched. Arthur nodded grimly. And whoever this descendant is, they're still here. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the tunnel, a faint metallic sound, like a door slamming somewhere above. Arthur raised his flashlight, tense. Did you hear that? He whispered. Clara nodded, clutching her lantern. We're not alone down here. They turned off their lights and listened. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. Arthur motioned for silence. He reached for his pistol, keeping it low. The footsteps grew louder, echoing against the stone walls until they stopped just beyond the entrance to the chamber. Stay behind me, he murmured. But before he could move, a voice spoke from the shadows. Calm, measured, and hauntingly familiar. Looking for the truth again, detective? Some things should stay buried. Clara froze. That voice, it was the same as before. Edward, she breathed. Arthur stepped forward, flashlight raised. Show yourself. The beam caught a glimpse of a figure, a man in a dark coat, his face half hidden. For an instant, the light reflected off a silver ring on his hand, the same ring Edward used to wear. Then, just as quickly, the light flickered and went out. Gunfire echoed through the tunnel. Clara screamed, ducking behind a crate as dust and debris filled the air. When the noise stopped, Arthur called out, Clara, stay back. But when the smoke cleared, the figure was gone, leaving only footprints in the dust and a small, folded piece of paper on the floor. Arthur picked it up, reading the message scrawled across it. You're chasing ghosts. Stop or she dies next time. Arthur's jaw tightened. He's watching us. Whoever he is, he's one step ahead. Clara's voice trembled, but it was Edward's voice. I know it. Arthur met her eyes. Then either he's alive or someone wants you to believe he is. Clara looked around the chamber once more. The shelves, the documents, the secrets, they were all part of something bigger than her. As they climbed back toward the surface, she glanced over her shoulder at the darkness below. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of light, and the faint outline of a man watching her from the shadows. When she blinked, he was gone. But she heard him again. Soft, distant, almost affectionate. You were never supposed to find me, Clara. The following day dawned gray and restless, the wind howling through the cliffs as if warning Marlowe's end of what was coming. Clara stood at her window, staring at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, calm yet deceiving, like the lies that had built her life. She barely noticed when Arthur entered the room, his boots muddy from the long walk up the hill. You didn't answer the door, he said quietly. I didn't hear you, she murmured. He studied her for a moment, then placed a folder on the table. I've been digging through town archives all morning. You were right, Clara. The Ashbournes didn't all die in the fire. Clara turned sharply. What do you mean? Arthur opened the folder, revealing faded documents, family records, and a birth certificate that looked newer than the rest. One of them survived, a boy, barely 10 years old. His name was Elias Ashbourne. He was adopted by another family in Marlowe's End and given a new name. Clara's eyes widened. Elias. Arthur nodded. He grew up to be Edward Winslow. For a long moment, Clara couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt, and she gripped the back of a chair for balance. No, she whispered. That can't be true. I checked every record twice, Arthur said. The handwriting matches. The dates line up. Your husband was the last living heir of the Ashbourne family. She shook her head, tears glimmering in her eyes. He never told me. He said his parents died in a fire when he was a child, but he never said who they were. Arthur sighed. Maybe he didn't want you to know. The Ashbournes were tied to terrible things, experiments, corruption, even murder. If Edward found out who he really was, maybe he tried to expose it. And someone wanted him silenced. Clara stared out the window again, her voice trembling. Then whoever's haunting me isn't just after me. They're after the last secret Edward tried to protect. They spent the afternoon going through Edward's notes again, searching for any clue that might connect the puzzle pieces. Among the scribbled coordinates and cryptic sketches, Arthur found a symbol, a small crest shaped like an hourglass surrounded by flames. "That's the Ashbourne seal," he said, tracing it with his finger. "I saw it once in the archives. It was said to mark everything they considered sacred or dangerous." Clara nodded slowly. "There's one more page," she said, reaching for the last folded sheet. "Edward wrote this the night before he disappeared." She unfolded the paper carefully. The ink was smudged, but the words were still legible. "The truth lies beneath the manor, in the heart of the cliffs." The archive was only the beginning. "If you find this, Clara, promise me you'll finish what I started. Don't let them rewrite our past." Arthur looked up sharply. "Beneath the manor? That means—" "There's another chamber," she said, finishing his thought. "A second archive." That night, as the storm returned with renewed fury, they began their search. Clara led Arthur to the cellar beneath the manor, a place she had avoided for years. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of salt water. "Edward used to come down here for hours," she said. "He said he was cataloging old family records. I never thought to question it." Arthur shone his flashlight across the stone walls. "If he built something here, we'll find it." They moved crates and old furniture aside until Clara's hand brushed against a loose section of wall. When she pressed it, a faint grinding sound echoed through the cellar. A hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow tunnel descending into darkness. Arthur gave a low whistle. "You married a man full of surprises." Clara managed a weak smile. "You have no idea." The tunnel stretched deeper than she expected. The sound of the storm above faded as they descended, replaced by a distant, rhythmic dripping. At the end of the passage, they found a steel door marked with the same hourglass crest. Arthur examined it. "It's locked." Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket Edward had given her, the one she had found at the bridge. She turned it over and noticed a small, hidden key embedded inside. Her breath caught. "Of course," she whispered. "He left the key with me all along." The key fit perfectly. With a sharp click, the door swung open. The chamber beyond was unlike anything they had seen before. Walls lined with filing cabinets, journals, and photographs covered decades of history. Maps pinned to corkboards connected the Ashbourne family to politicians, doctors, and industrial magnates, all under different names. Arthur stepped closer to one of the files. "This isn't just a family secret," he muttered. "This is a web of influence spanning generations." Clara found a folder labeled Project Hallowed Echo. She opened it and began to read. The Ashbourne line sought to preserve memory beyond death. Through chemical and psychological manipulation, they attempted to transfer fragments of identity from one host to another, creating living vessels of the past. Clara's blood ran cold. They were experimenting on people to preserve consciousness. Arthur's expression darkened. And if Edward found this, he might have discovered he wasn't entirely himself, she finished softly. That part of him wasn't his own. Suddenly, the lights in the chamber flickered. Arthur spun around. "Someone's here." A faint hum filled the air, followed by footsteps from the tunnel. The sound was slow, deliberate. Clara stepped back, fear rising in her throat. Then he appeared, Edward Winslow, or the man who looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow but alive. He stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Hello, Clara," he said softly. Her heart froze. "Edward?" Arthur raised his weapon, his voice low. "Don't move." Edward's gaze never left Clara. "Still the faithful detective, I see. Always pointing guns at ghosts." Arthur didn't lower the weapon. "You died 10 years ago." Edward tilted his head slightly. "Did I?" Clara took a step forward, her voice trembling. "How are you alive?" He smiled faintly. Alive is a generous word. I survived, but not as I was. The Ashbournes perfected their work before the fire. My family's curse, our echoes, were passed on. I was the last experiment. Arthur frowned. You're saying you're one of their vessels? Edward nodded. I carry their memories, their sins. I tried to destroy everything connected to them, but I couldn't. They're part of me. That's why I disappeared. I didn't want you to see what I'd become. Clara's eyes filled with tears. You should have told me. I couldn't, he whispered. Because the truth isn't finished yet. There's one more secret, Clara, one they buried even deeper. And now they'll come for you, too. Before she could speak, a deafening sound echoed through the tunnel, the steel door slamming shut. Edward turned sharply. They found us. Arthur grabbed Clara's arm. Move. The lights flickered again, and through the doorway came shadowed figures, 3 men, dressed in black, their faces hidden. Edward stepped forward, his tone calm but deadly. You shouldn't have come. The first man raised a weapon, but before he could fire, Edward lunged, tackling him to the ground. A chaos erupted, gunshots, shouts, the sound of metal striking stone. Arthur pulled Clara behind a cabinet, shielding her. Stay down. When the noise faded, the chamber was a wreck, papers scattered, shelves overturned. Edward stood bleeding near the door, one of the intruders unconscious at his feet. Arthur aimed his pistol at the others, but they retreated into the tunnel, vanishing into the dark. Clara rushed to Edward's side. You're hurt. He shook his head weakly. It doesn't matter. You have to finish this, Clara. Take the files. Burn them. Don't let them find the rest. Arthur frowned. The rest? Edward's eyes met Clara's. There's another archive. Not here in London. The Institute continued the experiments. They still believe in the echo. He coughed, blood on his lips. Promise me, Clara. End it. Her tears fell freely. I promise. Edward smiled faintly. Then my past can finally sleep. And as the storm raged above, Edward Winslow, last heir of the Ashbournes, fell silent. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean but eerily quiet. The manor stood beneath a pale sky, its windows reflecting the calm sea. Inside, the silence felt heavy, as though the house itself mourned. Clara sat by the fireplace, Edward's body covered with a white sheet in the next room. The faint scent of gunpowder and rain still lingered in the air. She held his locket tightly in her hand, her thumb tracing the tiny crack in its glass. Arthur stood near the window, looking out toward the cliffs. We should call the authorities, he said quietly. She didn't answer. Clara, he tried again. We can't hide this. I'm not hiding anything, she said softly. I'm finishing what he started. Arthur turned to her, weary and cautious. You mean the London Archive? She nodded. If Edward was right, the Institute continued the experiments there. That's where this ends. Arthur exhaled deeply. Then we'll go together. 2 days later, they arrived in London under a sky the color of steel. The city felt colder than Clara remembered. Every street seemed to hum with secrets, every shadow a silent observer. Arthur had arranged for them to stay near Ravenscroft Square, a forgotten corner of the city that once housed the Archival Institute. The building was still there, a gray fortress of stone and glass, its iron gate chained shut. The name on the plaque had been removed, but Clara could still make out the faded letters beneath the grime. This is it, Arthur murmured. They cut the lock and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with dust and the faint smell of chemical decay. Their footsteps echoed down the long corridor, where portraits of long-dead benefactors stared from the walls. Edward's notes had been clear. The truth lies in sublevel 3. They found the elevator rusted shut, so they took the stairs, descending deeper beneath the earth until they reached a metal door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Arthur forced it open with a crowbar, and they entered a vast underground chamber filled with flickering lights and old machinery. Rows of glass tanks lined the walls, each one empty, save for faint residues of what looked like ash. On the far wall, a cracked emblem bore the same hourglass crest surrounded by flames. Clara's voice trembled. This was their lab. Arthur moved toward a control panel covered in dust. Looks like they shut it down years ago. Or moved it, she said, scanning the room. She stopped when she saw a stack of sealed folders inside a glass cabinet. The lock was already broken. She reached inside and pulled one out. Across the cover were the words, Project Hallowed Echo, Phase 3. She opened it carefully. The photographs inside showed rows of subjects, men and women, sitting motionless with wires attached to their heads. The captions chilled her blood. Transfer successful. Host retains partial memory. Echo stable. Arthur muttered. My God, they were creating living vessels. People who carried fragments of others inside them. Clara flipped to the next page, where she found a familiar name printed in bold. Subject 17, Edward Winslow, formerly Elias Ashbourne. She covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. They experimented on him. They turned him into one of them. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder. He must have discovered it later. That's why he ran. He wanted to destroy this place. They searched deeper into the lab, following a trail of old papers and cracked glass until they reached a small office at the far end. The door hung crookedly, and inside the room, the desk was covered in dust and broken glass. On the wall behind the desk hung a framed photograph. Edward, younger and smiling, standing beside a group of men in lab coats. One of the men looked familiar. Clara stepped closer, her heart thudding. Arthur. He frowned. What is it? She pointed at the man beside Edward, a man with sharp eyes and graying hair. That's your father. Arthur froze. The air seemed to vanish from the room. No, he said slowly, shaking his head. That's impossible. Clara stared at him, realization dawning. He was part of the institute. Arthur stepped back, his face pale. He worked in government research, but he never said. Arthur, she whispered. Your father was one of them. That's how Edward got involved. That's how you knew about the Ashbourne fire, the archives, everything. You've been part of this story all along. He stared at the floor, guilt and disbelief warring in his eyes. I didn't know. I swear, Clara. I didn't know. She looked away, her voice soft. None of us did. Not really. A sudden metallic clang echoed through the corridor outside. Arthur drew his gun, motioning for silence. The sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't alone. Clara extinguished her lantern, plunging the room into shadows. A faint beam of light cut through the doorway, a flashlight sweeping across the hall. Then a voice, calm and commanding. Clara Winslow. Detective Harris. You've seen what you shouldn't have. Arthur's jaw tightened. Who's there? The figure stepped into view, a tall man in a black coat, his face half hidden behind a mask. But his voice was unmistakable. I am the continuation, he said. The final echo. Clara's heart froze. Edward? The man tilted his head. Not exactly. The consciousness that was Edward lives on. But I am what he left behind, the perfected version of the Ashbourne line. Arthur aimed his gun. You're lying. The man smiled faintly. Truth and lies are the same when memory is rewritten. We preserve what we choose to remember. He took a step closer. You can't destroy the past, Clara. You can only become part of it. Before Arthur could react, the man lunged forward, striking the weapon from his hand. The gun clattered to the floor, and the room erupted in chaos. Arthur swung at him, but the man moved with unnatural speed, his movements fluid, precise. Clara grabbed a nearby metal pipe and struck the masked figure across the back. He stumbled, but only for a moment. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. You're just like him, he hissed. Always digging where you shouldn't. She glared through her tears. Then maybe it's time someone buried you instead. She twisted free and slammed the pipe into the control panel behind him. Sparks flew, and the machines around them roared to life. The tanks along the wall began to hum, lights flickering as alarms blared. Arthur lunged forward, tackling the man as the room filled with smoke and the smell of burning wires. They struggled near the edge of a pit where the floor had collapsed. "Arthur!" Clara shouted. Arthur swung again, but the man caught his arm, pushing him toward the ledge. For a terrifying moment, both men teetered on the edge. Then Arthur kicked backward, sending the masked figure falling into the darkness below. The sound of his fall echoed for several seconds before fading completely. Arthur turned, coughing through the smoke. "We have to go." Clara grabbed the files from the desk and ran with him through the corridor. Behind them, flames began to spread as the machines overloaded. The building shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. They burst through the exit and into the cold London night just as the ground trembled and the Institute collapsed inward, the echoes of its destruction swallowed by the storm. Hours later, they sat by the river, watching the smoke rise into the dawn sky. Clara held the last folder in her lap, the only surviving record of Project Hallowed Echo. Arthur turned to her. "What now?" She stared at the file for a long moment, then tossed it into the river. The pages spread like pale wings before sinking beneath the water. "The past should stay buried," she said softly, "but its echoes will always find a way to be heard." Arthur nodded. "Do you think he's really gone?" Clara looked toward the horizon where the first light touched the waves. "No," she whispered. "Some echoes never fade." Weeks passed. The manor at Marlowe's end stood silent once more, the sea calm against the cliffs. Clara often sat by the window, the locket resting beside her. She had rebuilt her life piece by piece, though the past still whispered in the corners of her mind. One evening, as the sun set in crimson hues, she opened the locket again. For the first time, she noticed something hidden beneath the photograph, a faint engraving etched into the silver. It read, "Every echo begins with a voice." She smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Goodbye, Edward," she whispered. Outside, the sea answered in a low murmur, soft, eternal, and filled with the weight of forgotten memories. And somewhere deep beneath the cliffs, where the earth met the sea, a faint hum stirred once more. The echo had not yet died.